if there's no national or local control of the police, like, they're like, what's
What
going
do you
on?
know? They behave like a mob. It's so shocking.
Right.
They behave like a criminal enterprise.
And and then you talk about sort of like how things have changed from state to state, but also the relationship between the people living in that state and how things have changed is also off. Talk about that dynamic.
Exactly. So this last crisis is sort of one of electoral democracy, of free and fair elections and responsiveness to majorities and the mass public in the US. So a decline of democracy. And that goes along with this delegation over the past generation of national power to the states, greater leeway for the states to customize. And then what I show statistically, again, is especially over the past 20 years and especially since 2010, there's been huge divergence. A huge gap has arisen between states in terms of how easy it is to vote, the fairness of their districting in terms of gerrymandering, how responsive they are in passing policy compared to what the public of their state actually wants in surveys, and in terms of sort of election integrity and sort of election vote counting and such. So again, the US super unique, the only real developed democracy to put all that authority over democratic institutions, districting, vote counting, who's eligible to vote and not, all done at that lower level unit. And just zooming out a second, if you guys remember after 2016, everybody was saying like, thank God for federalism. Trump can't capture all these state election administrations and every county election administrator is not going to flip. And if it was all centralized in DC, we'd be done for. We'd have an autocrat in power. And while that's like narrowly true, like once a would-be autocrats in Washington, DC, you don't want to like give them all the election administration. But before that, over long stretches of time, the 2010s decline of democracy in the states, and states regulate elections from like local dog catcher up to president, that has enabled and empowered and made more likely a would-be autocrat taking national power, and now has the potential to essentially subvert or steal the 2024 presidential election, as you guys have talked about on the show.
Well, because we also have the results that we're going to reap from the Supreme Court hearing the case on state legislatures having more jurisdiction over federal elections and determining how those votes are counted and in what way. I mean, we don't know what the scope of the ruling is going to be, but it's fair to assume that they're going to side with these Republican state legislatures. Like, what does that portend for the decline of our democracy and how someone like, say, Trump could take over again in 24?
Yeah, so, that's a step beyond what I was just talking about in terms of all this voter suppression and bias gerrymandering. That has real effects, right? So that means gerrymandering, for example, makes it so an anti-abortion minority of voters can set a majority of a state legislature, right, and pass an abortion ban. That's really meaningful. It's not at the level of Jim Crow or slavery, right? Those were state laws that were a bigger deal even than this. But what you're talking about, the independent state legislature's doctrine in the Supreme Court, which could be ruled on, and I'm no big city lawyer, but like, I think you're right, Emma, there's a good chance they'll pass it and say essentially state legislatures can choose which presidential candidate to give their electoral college votes, regardless of what voters say, meaning a single swing state legislature could essentially throw a presidential election. And in 2024, that would produce a real constitutional crisis. And that would be a whole new front on this exact where we started, right? Using state level decentralized authority, right, at the lower level for national political project for national power over the national direction of the country there.
You had mentioned about abortion in terms of and some of these other issues where you have the polling showing that people's views on these things have remained static, even though the sort of like state by state regime of these things have sort of flipped in many respects. There was a statistic that you had in there. I think it was 14 states there are 14 states where abortion will be restricted or banned, where the population, the majority of the population does not want that, but there is no reverse. Will you just tease that out and
Exactly.
articulate it better than I have?
So I, along with Chris Warshaw, another political scientist at George Washington University, we're looking at public opinion towards abortion in the states and really like banning abortion essentially fully or except for life of the mother. And about 41 states and 61% of the whole country supports legal abortion in this sort of definition. And that's been totally stable over the past generation, right? Unlike same-sex marriage, which like was becoming hugely popular culturally, and then the Supreme Court, as it becomes very popular, legalizes it nationally, right? Whereas here, this is like a stable majority support, and the Supreme Court takes a ruling that really goes against public opinion in this way, gives more leeway to the states, and this is a classic pattern in American democratic backsliding, going back to the end of Reconstruction and other times, is the Supreme Court says, listen, states, you can do whatever you want. States then sort of backslide democracy, do things against public opinion or restrict democracy. And then Congress decides whether to step up and get their asses in gear and block that and standardize, create floors or baseline rules for the states. And they often don't, right? So right now what you're seeing with abortion is, you're exactly right. There's no state with an anti-abortion majority, or there's no state with an anti-abortion majority that's not going to ban abortion, right? But there are a number of states with pro-choice majorities that are going to ban abortion. The Kansas referendum is an exception there, where the voters stepped up and said, no, we don't want this abortion ban. So it's going to be 13 states, and that maybe eventually more. But in the meantime, we already see news stories of how this is affecting pregnant women and families and so forth. This is really meaningful stuff. But gerrymandering in the 2010s set mathematical records in terms of partisan gerrymandering. There's various types of Jim Crow racial gerrymandering that are different, but in partisan gerrymandering, states like Wisconsin and North Carolina, this is not like me just exaggerating. They set mathematical records for like how many votes it would take above majority of the state's voters to get a Democratic state legislative majority. And then those gerrymandered Republican state legislative majorities are able to pass unpopular policies like an abortion ban without getting voted out of office. That's hugely problematic for basic democratic functioning and being responsive to majorities in your state.